Every history has to start somewhere. So how did we get here? Well, the origin story of that giant tunnel out there in the main hallway, A People's History of Tech, starts here at the conference, as he mentioned, 10 years ago. This is my friend, Emily. Her pronouns are she, her. Emily is a medium-height white woman with a brown bob and a fabulous pink dress. I met her 10 years ago, here, when she had been tasked to build a matrix that would help translate participants' experience and reflections into the many possible futures, leveraging the collective wisdom of the crowd here at the conference.
And this is Sarah. Sarah's pronouns are she, her. And for those of you listening, Sarah is also a medium-height white woman with a brown bob, except she is wearing a fabulous green suit. Sarah was here 10 years ago presenting on the importance of data literacy and the stakes of understanding our algorithmic and digitally mediated lives. And when people came out of her talk, they would come running towards the matrix, desperate to make sure that the future included greater regulation of our technology. And it made a lot of sense that the GDPR was only a few years to follow.
And so both of us have ample record of that experience at the conference because we had these devices in our pockets. Just 10 years ago, phones didn't come preloaded with emoji character sets yet. And so I spent the conference running around handing out emoji stickers as a novelty. And Martin here chose the no mobile phones as his spirit emoji that day.
And I used my brand new iPhone camera back then to take a very grainy video inside the conference hall asking everybody to say hi to my team. I won't force you to do that this time.
So after that, Emily and I followed each other on LinkedIn and Instagram and stayed ambiently aware of each other's lives for a while.
Which in and of itself is kind of ironic, considering that the big takeaway from the Matrix project at the conference a decade ago was how deeply anxious Europeans felt about American tech cultural hegemony, right? That our unfettered capitalism and individualism was seeping outside of our borders through the consolidated and secretive power of the largest tech companies. And yet, we were all still using their tools. Right? Because big tech has done one thing very, very well. It has moved the Overton window of what is acceptable. We will accept our data being used far beyond our control for conveniences like, staying in touch. It's one easy checkbox. I accept. And once you accept it, it can be very hard to take your power back. So in 2022, as was mentioned, I was one of 20 folks working in technology justice who convened for the inception of the Tech We Want, which is this multi-year, multi-million-dollar effort, it's going to need a lot more money than that, by Omidyar Network to create the conditions for a more just and sustainable future of technology. And our focus almost immediately, and you can see who is up here, some former conference speakers as well, was power and agency. And one of the first exercises they had us do together was what they called a tech timeline, a long sheet of paper with some major milestones in the history of technology. So these folks, experts across engineering, design, ethics, policy, and organizing, started filling in the significant historical context that simply isn't widely known. And we also started telling our own very personal stories about how we were impacted by technology and the industry around it. And while we all may have known the headline version of the things that had happened to each other, to hear what it was to have actually lived those experiences, for example, the very deep, very personal, and very deeply litigated harm that led to policy change, it really shifted our perspective. Together as a group, we realized that we cannot shape a future for tech that serves the collective good without sharing a more just and representative history of tech. And so I got handed this project, and I was like, well, me? I don't do research, I don't know. And so I thought, who is the person that I know who cares the most about the stories that people tell about technology? And I thought of Sarah, and though we hadn't spoken in 8 years, I called her up, and I said, we've got this wild idea. could we build a collective storytelling project to reclaim the narrative for the people and claw our power back from the big tech giants and Stanford dropouts? A history that can reflect all of our collective experiences. So how might we make a tech timeline exercise outside of a group of tech workers to anyone, anywhere who could participate? Ready, go, Sarah.
So on vibes and vision alone, I was ready to jump in head first and help shape this collaborative storytelling project. And primarily because the tech nostalgia and the meme potential were just far too compelling. Now, almost everyone has a story connected to their mobile phone, which is partly why we chose it as our starting point. Perhaps no technology has changed our lives more. The supercomputer we carry around in our pockets today have evolved so much in the short span of our lifetimes here in this room. Mobile phones are ubiquitous, deeply personal, intimate, and integral to our daily lives. And the history of the mobile phone goes back further than we probably realize, as far back as 1969 here in the Nordics. That's when representatives from Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland came together, already assuming that the future of communication was mobile, and they came together to figure out a shared collective vision for the future of this technology, one that was borderless, interoperable, and open source. And so these meetings in 1969 led to the development of the Nordic Mobile Telephone Network, the world's first international cellular network. And then this became the precursor to the global GSM network and the standards that drove adoption of 2G. But Silicon Valley is quick to often forget these collaborative and collective origin stories, even of our mobile history. So we thought, okay, if we're going to build a more collaborative, more representative history, then we need a scaffolding to support that story that helps evoke people's lived experiences of technology. So to start, we needed to build a timeline of events of, like all the things that have ever happened in the history of technology. Easy task, right? But if the goal was to access a sense of agency and power, then we needed to explore the natural tensions in the history of technology between things like risk and safety, connection and access, materials and waste, all to make space for the spectrum of the benefits and the harms of that technology represents. So for example, we highlight things like the invention of infinite scroll, and then later, the rise of doom scrolling. Or the advent of Twitter, RIP, and then the rise of and adoption of Twitter in efforts like the Arab Spring. So it's not just about what these technologies do, but it's also about how people use them, and more importantly, how they make us feel. So how do we actually get people to tell us their stories? Well, for this, we turned to the experts. We modeled our prompts after the best practices from public media storytelling projects like StoryCorps or the US Library of Congress. And we also looked to projects like Queering the Map and Post Secret for inspiration on how to elicit some of these compelling, deeply personal stories. And so very simply, we asked people to tell us about a time when, and then figure out where to place it on the timeline, wherever they felt appropriate.
So our first experiments were very simple. We printed out a timeline with only 40 events out of everything that's ever happened, and that Sarah curated. We smacked it on a wall, and we put out those prompts on a piece of paper. You'll see some of that reflected in what's in the hallway as well.
V1.
The V1. And what we observed were two things that told us we might be on the right path. And the first was that with the events that we were curating, using those tensions, people were learning things, right? So we'd hear things like, I never knew about the Arab Spring, or at an event full of young people, I'd never heard of the GDPR. And also, people were actively responding to feeling represented by this timeline. Somebody came up to me and sort of squeezed my wrists and said, it means so much to me that you would include the Arab Spring, right? So representation became really important. But the second thing we learned, this is really fun, and I'm sure you have, if you've been in there, you've already experienced this yourself. People's approach to the timeline completely changes from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. When it starts and it's just the events on the timeline, people will go up, they'll approach the timeline, and they'll kind of read it chronologically, usually left to right. But once the stories start getting populated, they completely ignore any of the historical context. They go directly for the personal stories first, and then they look at the historical context around it to see, like, well, what was this all about? And what I really love about that is that it just shows that it affirms sort of our original thesis. Oh yeah, sorry, you got a good time. The history of tech that's actually important to people is not what happened. It's how it felt. It's how we experienced it. And as you just noticed, the people's history of tech is intimate. It's funny. It's embarrassing. It's fascinating.
It's also nostalgic for a time when mobile phones were simpler, more durable, and frankly, way more accessible. And so, one of our accessibility testers lamented the fragility of today's smartphones compared to the indestructible bricks of yesterday.
And if you go out in the hall and you see the Nokia that's hanging early on in the timeline, that thing is in perfect condition, whereas all the iPhones smashed to smithereens.
Yes. It's also vulnerable. Erica posted this note on the timeline for harassment she experienced in 2007, the same year that we marked as the rise of cyberbullying on the timeline. And in this post, she expresses the tension of experiencing this harm and yet still being unwilling to give up her phone. It's also expansive. This curious traveler observed protest signs around a mining village in Chile. And later, I was able to look up photos of the posters that she had been describing. And the indigenous community there was boycotting cell phones due to the environmental impacts of mining in their water supply.
So this week in Malmö, we have expanded the scope of our experiments. We've endeavored to make experiential that which is often hidden, from the code of a People's History of Tech website itself to the waste that comes from the relationships with our phones. So artist Justin Amrine, who's here with us this week, has taken inspiration from our open source code to create an exterior infrastructural blueprint that maybe we fantasize could scrub the ocean of all the microplastics that we have put there. And we have collected e-waste from just one office in this community, which we will later recycle. I know it doesn't solve things, Georgie, don't get upset. But you multiply that one old cell phone or the broken, dusty, sticky, headphones so in gross. Your junk drawer in your apartment, and you multiply that by one workplace, and the environmental impact becomes clear. After touching all of that stuff, I could never use a cell phone. I feel like I could never use a cell phone again, and I'd be fine.
So, mobile phones are just the beginning of a people's history of tech. We treated this year like a startup MVP with the intention of learning as we go and gathering more collaborative partners and supporters along the way. So here's what we see as next. First, we want to expand the scope. We want to explore a people's history of the internet, a people's history of social media, a people's history of AI. What does that look like? Next, we want to expand the form. So we want to move beyond the temporary exhibits you see here in the hallway to create more permanent, interactive installations that continuously evolve with new contributions. And lastly, we want to expand participation. From day one, this project has been an open source, open culture project. And so we invite any engineers in the crowd to check out our GitHub and help us expand the functionality and accessibility of the digital archive.
People feel a sense of their own power when they're given a chance to tell their stories. They may also become aware of when they didn't feel power, or when too much power had been ceded to the devices and companies we've all come to depend on. That all-powerful I accept checkbox has shifted the responsibility for deciding what is actually acceptable to us. Is it acceptable that we mine all this ore for new phones? Is it acceptable that we outsource the harm of content moderation to where people can be paid the least to do it? Is it acceptable that so much innovation is foisted upon us when it is not being done responsibly? Is it acceptable to call it innovation if it is not done responsibly? We give a lot of power away to decide what is acceptable in exchange for personal convenience.
A people's history of tech aims to make these power dynamics more explicit. In becoming aware of our agency, in the decisions about what we buy, what default settings we alter, what policies we demand, and most importantly, how we relate to each other through technology, we begin to take back our power.
So reflecting on our place in a more inclusive history, witnessing the human impacts of technology, examining intimately, how did all of us get here?
That activates us to harness our power in shaping the tech we want in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.